I am still somewhat baffled by the fact that Montesquieu never explicitly identifies a moment where Rome was at its greatest. Nevertheless, the greatness of Rome comes out in the contrast with the decadence of Carthage. In the aftermath of Cannae, the Carthaginian defeat of Rome so close to the great city of Rome, we get much praise for Rome. I mentioned this last time. Let us take a look at Montesquieu's statements about this from chapter 5. One of them, he says, Rome was a marvel of constancy. After the battle of Ticinus, Trebia, Lake Trasimene, after Cannae, more dismal still, abandoned by almost all the peoples of Italy, it did not sue for peace. The reason is that the Senate never departed from its old maxims. Rome was saved by the strength of its institutions. After the Battle of Cannae, not even the women were permitted to shed tears. The Senate refused to ransom the prisoners and sent the miserable remains of the army to make war in Sicily. Earlier in the chapter, Montesquieu says that the Romans at that point still had old morals, favoring poverty. Furthermore, it had a remarkable public spiritedness, a self-forgetting devotion to the eternal city. In Rome, quote, public office could be attained only through virtue, and brought with it no benefits other than honor and being preferred for other toils. Much more can be noticed in this area. What were these policies? The Roman tough guy foreign policy was enforced by the Senate, and it is described in chapter 6, entitled The Conduct the Romans Pursued to Subjugate All Peoples. Montesquieu credits the Senate for acting with profundity and constancy in maintaining these policies when so many others would become negligent or distracted by other goals. Rome's policy was to divide its enemies and therefore weaken them, and to prepare itself for their slow conquest. It did this in 1,000 dishonest and unjust ways that Montesquieu catalogues for us in chapter 6. Near the end of the chapter, Montesquieu seems to level a nice description of the Romans, who were masters of the world. They assigned all its treasures to themselves, and in plundering were less unjust as conquerors than as legislators. He says something similar a bit later. Quote, for not even the justice of brigands, who bring a certain honesty to the practice of crime, was to be found among the Romans. 1,000 crimes were committed just to give the Romans all the money in the world. Are these compliments? In any event, the Senate is the head of Rome's aristocratic republic, and many of these descriptions seem to come from the post-Great Rome period. These policies of foreign conquest, where Rome would allow other people to govern themselves as long as they paid much tribute to Rome, reflected the dissensions that always existed in the city. As Montesquieu writes at the beginning of chapter 8, quote, while Rome conquered the world, a secret war was going on within its walls. Its fires were like those of volcanoes, which burst forth whenever some matter comes along to increase their activity. Here we have a nice statement of how the class conflict in Rome prodded each of the classes into serving the public good, almost by accident. When the kings were ousted, the government became aristocratic, and the patricians cultivated within the people an immoderate desire for liberty and an immoderate hatred for executive power or kingship. The people, therefore, became jealous, eventually, of the aristocratic institutions themselves, and they demanded representation of their own in the form of the tribunes, who could veto laws. This kind of institutionalized conflict between the plebeians and the patricians, or between the people and the Senate, was really headed by the Senate while Rome was great, though, it seems. Montesquieu has a hilarious paragraph where he describes the virtues of the people and the virtues of the Senate in chapter 8 on page 85 of the Lowenthal translation and the Cornell edition. The virtues of the people. The people are good at having a lot of people and resisting those who resist them. The virtues of the Senate. The Senate has wisdom, justice, patriotism, intelligence. It is good at managing money and managing institutions. It has prudence and countless other good qualities. It was kind of good that the Senate was in charge, though the people hated them for it. But its virtues did not stop the Senate from losing to the people and Rome from becoming a popular state. A new dynamic was born, and in this new dynamic, the republic changed to an empire. The new dynamic was this. The people detested the senators as obstacles to their rule, and they would slowly remove the prerogatives from the Senate and place them in the hands of one of their own who rose above. We can almost put a finger on this. Montesquieu has much to say about the corruption of the Romans that happens after the final defeat of Carthage in the Third Punic War. Montesquieu discusses this only in chapter 8 on the dissensions that always existed in the city, right after the hilarious praise of the balanced constitution. Then, after Carthage had gone down, he writes, the plebes reduced the Senate in its conflicts, and the old morals died. Class conflict became deadly. Here is Montesquieu. With the passage of time, the plebeians had so reduced the patricians that this distinction among families became empty, and all were elevated to honors indifferently. Then there arose new disputes between the common people, agitated by their tribunes and the leading families, whether patrician or plebeian, who were called nobles, and who had on their side the Senate, which was composed of them. Since the old morals no longer existed, since individuals had immense riches, and since riches necessarily confer power, the nobles resisted with more force than had the patricians, and this was the cause of the death of the Gracchi and of several who worked for their scheme." End quote. A secret alliance between the people and the great formed, though at this time the Senate assassinated the Gracchi, who sought to forge the alliance between the people and the great first. We will see this alliance between the people and the great in the 1st century BC with men like Sulla and Marius and Pompey and Julius Caesar. This was when the people could give their favorites, as Montesquieu writes in chapter 9, a formidable authority abroad, and all the wisdom of the Senate became useless, and the Republic was lost. So we see the old morals favoring poverty were dead in 130 BC, when the Gracchi reforms of the land, or returning land to the people, and the old class competition had died. The political greatness of Rome does not coincide with the great building of the Roman Empire. Corruption set in before the Republic was dead. Montesquieu underlines this conclusion immediately after mentioning that the old morals were dead and the old political institutions had been corrupted. In this context, he mentions what he calls the wise institution of the censors, who protected the discipline, austerity, and customs of the old constitution. Montesquieu's praise for the censors appears to know no bounds. Quote, "In Rome, Everything that could introduce dangerous novelties, change the heart and mind of the citizen, or deprive the state, if I dare use the term, of perpetuity, all disorders, domestic and public, were reformed by the censors. End quote. Then Montesquieu gives examples of how the censors maintained an honorable poverty within Rome. But hadn't Montesquieu just shown that the old morals, in fact, did die? Montesquieu quite obviously overstates the importance of the censors because, he says, all disorders were reformed by them, and he had just described the disorders that put an end to the Republic. Clearly, the office of censor had fallen into disuse well before the office itself was abolished under Caesar Augustus, and the office of censor could not change Rome from its corrupted state. So we need a summary statement. Rome, fighting a defensive war against Hannibal, was great, but Rome afterwards fought wars for conquest and empire, and became a lot more like the Carthaginians. It would not be the last time a country victorious on the battlefield would fall into a corruption that resembled its one-time enemy. What are the consequences of this cycle for Rome? The next chapters in Montesquieu's Considerations concern the great men of Rome, Sulla, Pompey, Julius Caesar. And we must also ask, is there a way out of this? We need to consider more Montesquieu's comparison between ancient and modern times if we're going to answer that question.